We cannot continue as we are, or the consequences will surely be dire.
A 2012 UN report states that a global population growth from 7 billion to almost 9 billion is expected by 2040. Demands for resources will rise exponentially. By 2030, requirements for food are projected to rise by 50%, energy by 45%, and water by 30%. We are presently depleting natural resources 50% faster than their planet can renew. At this rate, it is estimated that we'll need 3 more planet Earths to keep up with resource needs as they are today.
What is the 6th extinction? Is it happening right now? What's the cause of it?
What we as human beings are doing to the planet, changing the basic conditions of life very dramatically and very rapidly.
And yet, from environmental disaster to war, our obsolete value systems perpetuate insanity, threatening us on many fronts. Is it the best we can do to just clean up after the fact? Are politicians capable or even competent to manage the world around us?
Speaker, let me explain.
The Prime Minister.
Are we innately flawed in ways we can't change?
Why not just use firing squad?
We often hear that human nature is fixed.
Only human nature.
And our worst qualities are inborn.
How are they going to stop being criminals?
Oh, nonsense. They were born that way, and there's no use trying to change them.
And yet, considering our history of regression, warlike tendencies, jealousies, and hatred, we still have much to learn. One would think it impossible to simply overlook the conditions we're immersed in.
The culture doesn't know any better. They don't know what forces are involved in shaping human behavior. Therefore, they invent their own concept and project their own values into human behavior and say that's human nature. That's where they're wrong.
Human behavior is just as lawful as everything else.
The sunflower does not turn to the sun. The sun makes it turn by pulling in membranes. A sailboat cannot sail. The wind moves it. Plants can't grow. They are shoved by sunshine, soil, temperature, all kinds of things. All things are shoved by something else. All people are acted upon by other things. Remember, your mother said cup, table, light, papa, mama, over and over again until you did the same thing. Even race hatred is learned.
Awakened as the ideals of intolerance and racial superiority are taught to succeeding generations.
You can be brought up to hate Afro-Americans. You can be brought up to hate Jews, Swedes, all kinds of people.
I hate Filipinos. I hate Mexicans. I hate them all.
We can raise a Jewish boy in a Nazi culture and becomes a good Nazi.
Just like mechanical systems, our behavior has no single cause.
God gives people good blood and bad blood, and there's an end to it.
Our behavior is generated by the many interacting variables that we encounter.
Some researchers are posing that genes, rather than upbringing, determine if someone might become a criminal and even a murderer.
Genes don't give us a value system or a process level by which we operate. Behavior does not occur in a vacuum. It is always dependent on considerable environmental input.
I wanted to know whether men have a natural attitude toward women or do they learn it. So I went to some island years ago. But the interesting thing about the islands is they wore no clothing. And I never saw a male stare at the female body. Children swim nude when they're babies, boys and girls together. There was no peeping Toms on the island. There was no pictures of nude women up on the wall in their huts, because it was a normal thing to be nude. They said to the girl, "Me like you," and they stroked her from the top of the head all the way down. But they didn't go for the breasts. Men go for women's breasts in this country because they're taught, hey, get a load of that chick.
And whose fault is it?
It's not the Democrats' fault.
And it's all Obama's fault.
Blaming people for their behavior is one of the most detrimental things of our so-called advanced culture. Their behavior is shaped by the culture they're brought up in. There's no serial killer that doesn't have a background that made him that way. Every gangster, every New York gangster is made that way by associating with people like that.
Our social and legal systems blame and punish the individual. Yet these attempts to modify conduct by punitive means ignores the person's background and surroundings, which shape that behavior to begin with.
From old-school prison gangs to disruptive street gangs, it's a dangerous mix for staff and inmates alike.
Research shows that learning also changes the physical and chemical structure of the brain. Obviously, there are many contributing factors, but genes play a small role in comparison to the effects of the overall environment on how we learn.
No Chinese baby was ever born speaking Chinese. Did you know that? They had to go to school to learn the language. No French baby was ever born speaking French. No matter how many years the parents spoke French, they have to learn it.
We don't come to our own conclusions without any outside influences. We don't change our minds. Our minds are changed by events.
You heard about them Wright brothers?
No.
They say they want to build themselves a flying machine.
They ain't never gonna be no flying machine. If God wanted them to fly, he would give them wings.
Yeah.
Our minds are changed by events.
I changed my mind.
Yeah, me too.
If you're born with a brain that's more effective, faster than the average brain, you become a fascist faster if you're brought up in a fascist environment. A good brain cannot describe that which is significant. A brain has no mechanism of discrimination. Only experimental evidence determines that.
If the surroundings that establish our values remain unaltered, in spite of the urgings of poets, priests, and politicians, the same behavior and values will persist.
If you tell people that you're not to fish in a certain area, if you don't provide food for those people and the means of living, they will violate those laws. All laws have to coincide with the nature of the physical world. But it isn't the law that prevents crime. It's if you meet the conditions.
These days, rhino poachers come by helicopter, armed with powerful tranquilizers and a chainsaw. Rhino horn is now worth more than gold.
If people are unemployed, they will do whatever they have to do to feed their family. So if you make a law and say that you're not to steal food, they will steal food if that serves their family needs. Any law that's made by man that doesn't fit the circumstances of reality will be violated.
Higher ideals and aspirations that people hope for can't be realized when there is deprivation and war.
If you want to go bomb somebody, there's remarkably little discussion about how much it might cost, but when you have a discussion about whether or not we can assist people who are suffering, then suddenly we become very, cost conscious.
No culture evaluates human behavior in this way. If they did, they would question, what is it that generates greed, bigotry, inequities, and war?
They bring you up with the values that put them in power.
Unfortunately, all societies to date have indoctrinated people toward values that perpetuate those in power.
So, let's investigate the key factors governing the lives of people and nations. Money and the values, behaviors, and consequences it produces.
Time and sales data. Split-second stats.
As a remnant of antiquity, money now largely serves as a mechanism of corruption, deprivation, and control in the hands of a few.
It's corrupted everything. I mean, every institution that we live in is corrupted by money. What's fascinating to me is that we can become enslaved by something that we've created. Not physically, but just mentally enslaved by a notion that was invented by humanity. You know, it is archaic because I think we've grown past what money can do.
It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and money system, or if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. Henry Ford, Ford Motor Company.
In a desperate attempt to survive, many work multiple jobs. They may steal, lie, or embezzle.
So stress-producing that the average person worries about rent, losing their job, can't pay off the house.
On a bigger scale, the profit motive creates a ruthless cycle of devastation. Illness, pollution, and war are accepted as normal.
You have sort of a wartime economy that begins to be self-perpetuating, and you have powerful people inside of a power vacuum, really, you know, who see it as in their interest to perpetuate the conflict.
The banking system right now is effectively enslaving individuals, enslaving students, enslaving institutions, and sucking resources from them.
They set it up so that there would be private central banks that could charge everybody interest on the currency and allow themselves to get rich without having to do anything. Who's been doing all of this? It's a group of bankers, the Federal Reserve System. That's a private system.
The Fed is a private bank owned by private stockholders. Do not let the name Federal fool you.
In 1913, which is when Woodrow Wilson allowed the Federal Reserve System legislation to be passed, most of the Congress people had gone home.
This legislation turned the central bank system of the United States over to the Federal Reserve Board, making them the only group that could issue Federal Reserve notes or U.S. dollars.
President Wilson, he regretted that. He said that he had just sold this country downstream.
A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. A government by the opinion and the duress of small groups of dominant men. President Woodrow Wilson, 1916.
It's a fiat system that we operate under, and it's actually someone punching numbers on a computer somewhere. That is how we manufacture money today.
There's nothing backing it, there's nothing behind it.
When government spends more than it collects in taxes and needs money, it does not print its own money, but borrows from the Federal Reserve in exchange for U.S. bonds, which the Fed provides at interest. When people and corporations want money, they go to banks as well. The system is rigged. If a bank buys a $100 bond, the bank gets to lend out 10 times that amount, or $1,000. They created the extra funds from nothing. No money, gold, or anything to back it up. The bank also gets back the loans with interest for all the money lent. Money is created this way from the simple signature of a borrower with the promise to pay it back. And to make matters worse, very often people are paying the amount back many times over due to the interest. This is the process by which individuals, companies, and governments acquire money. It is respectably referred to as fractional reserve lending and is used globally by most other banking systems, keeping people and entire nations in perpetual debt.
So if you just keep printing dollars with no backing, at a certain point, people lose confidence in the currency, and that's what's happened.
The banking system right now is in the business of manufacturing risk by creating debt for individuals and people. And so there is the risk that those people will not pay that debt back. But the liabilities for the risk have been and continue to be assigned to the U.S. taxpayer in the U.S. currency.
We're now sitting in a situation where the world's currencies are about to crash. Nobody knows how long it's going to take, but the Federal Reserve System has been printing dollars like there's no tomorrow.
You have what is effectively a criminal enterprise based on the manipulation of people's attention, resources, and time in order to extract value from them.
They're stealing money from us that way. They're stealing the result of our efforts and our labor.
And that is something that has grown as a cancer on our society.
These bankers are all part of a system called the Bank for International Settlements.
Most people, even in business and banking, don't understand this bank and its role as the BIS.
They own 40% of the assets of the 43,000 companies that are traded on the capital markets.
The bank runs itself. It has a board of directors which is composed of 15 governors of central banks from around the world.
And they pull down 60% of the annual earnings. They bought up all our media, and that media is hoodwinking citizens.
The media has morphed into just peddling the corporate interests of the money masters that control the political establishment. There's about 118 boards of directors that sit on these 5 giant media corporations. And they all serve different boards, of Monsanto to weapons to food. So when you have all these interests bleeding together, it's that much harder to differentiate what interests you're seeing laid out in the mainstream media.
Fair, balanced.
If you want to understand power, you have to understand who nominates candidates, not understand who votes for candidates. Our system is not a democracy. The percentage of our population that participates in the nomination process is literally less than 5% of the population, and really less than 1% of the population. If I was in control of the nominating process of everything that everybody ate, and I always nominated cheeseburgers or fried chicken, and I told you that it was a democracy and you could eat anything you want as long as it was a cheeseburger or fried chicken, would that be a democracy? I could sell it to you as a democracy because I don't decide whether to eat cheeseburgers or fried chicken. You get to vote in a very large and well-publicized election as to whether we're going with fried chicken or cheeseburgers. And people organize into very tribal groups, being very anti-fried chicken and very pro-cheeseburger, or they'll explain to you exactly why cheeseburgers are going to be the end of the world and why fried chicken's going to save you.
Those who can afford it hire lobbyists who essentially buy politicians. Most of the time, either party will suit their needs.
Definition of a lobbyist in the United States is someone who advocates for someone else and is getting paid for it.
The laws then enacted are quite often written by the corporations to benefit themselves.
Professor Thurber sees an underground explosion in lobbying and estimates the industry actually brings in more than $9 billion a year, exceeded only by tourism and government.
The reason that we aren't changing things right now is the banks have lobbyists in Washington in numbers I've never seen.
Lobbyists are strictly there to buy access. They are not there to enhance the democratic process. Families and working people just don't have that kind of representation, power, or influence to look after their needs.
They've designed the system to reinforce and, in a sense, finance themselves based off of special interests.
Everything that was around in 2007, 2008, that we get so scared about, the mortgage-backed securities, the credit default swaps, the other derivatives, they still exist. They absolutely do. And yes, there's higher capital requirements for the banks, so they can't be as leveraged, but those are not that high.
And if we don't have a media that's providing who's really like writing these bills and passing this legislation and what it's all for and who it serves, then we're living in an illusion.
Well, I think that generally the laws in this country are written by the wealthy and the powerful, because I think by definition that's who controls the legislatures and the commanding heights of the power system in this country.
And that's a scary reality because you can pay your way into having laws implemented that serve you and your corporation as you would like them to serve.
The complete impunity that corporations have to operate unabated and pollute the entire planet.
A major spill of toxic coal ash is raising questions again about the safety of water and the government regulators overseeing industry.
There's zero accountability. I mean, other than slap on the wrist of a couple fines here and then. I mean, slave labor to the exploitation of resources on the planet.
The slap on the wrist of industries that pollute, cut corners, and violate policies will continue as long as it's profitable to do so.
JP Morgan paid $13 billion in fines last year. If you have that much money in order to just pay fines, and they put away $19 billion for paying fines.
JP Morgan is paying $410 million to settle charges with the government, but JP Morgan is not admitting any wrongdoing.
Goldman Sachs settled early on in this case for $550 million without admitting wrongdoing. UBS has agreed to pay about $50 million. Under the terms of the settlement, UBS did not admit any wrongdoing.
Well, I think that people commit the crimes that they're in a social position to commit. I think it was Bertolt Brecht that asked, which is a greater crime, to rob a bank or to own one? And I think as we've seen from everything from the savings and loan scandals to the Wall Street meltdown, that all too often the owners of the banks are frequently looting the institutions that employ them. They commit all manner of illegal acts, and yet they're very rarely prosecuted for them. And throughout history, there's been very little, I think, pretense that the government has always acted as an agent for the wealthy class.
Yes, there might be idealistic politicians that got into the game to change the world, but if they're good, any good at their job, they're no longer changing the world. They're serving the interests of their donors if they want to rise in the world of politics. If the bottom line and it's a profit-driven world, then those interests are going to be served first, and everything is going to be secondary, and that's the sad reality of it.
There is no value system that's put out there that is actually beneficial to humanity because it's based on consumerism.
And we use artificial pumping in animals to make them grow faster. So if you can multiply the cells in the chicken faster, you can sell it sooner. But does that have an effect on the human body? They don't worry about it. They worry about the sale of chickens.
Wealth is going to the rich faster than any other time in history.
The success of the industrialized world has been dependent on the failure and the lack of development of the developing world. I mean, the reason that they're stifled is because they are indebted to the first world. We wouldn't be prospering if it weren't for the labor that's going on and the indentured servitude that's going on in the entire developing country. And so that's the power dynamic can never change in that respect because it's literally dependent on it being that way.
The dirty and dangerous work done by children.
The jobs down in the pits are typically reserved for teenagers with only tree limbs to brace the mine walls. The risk to them is real.
Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop. But who's developing who here? Each year, poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion every year.
Money systems have existed for centuries, and whether we realize it or not, have always been used to control behavior by limiting the purchasing power of the majority of people. One example of this is the criminal justice system.
Many proclaim prisons don't work, but ultimately, prisons are a resounding success as a tool for social control to safeguard the political and economic established system.
If you hire people whose only expertise is caging people to try to fix social problems, you're not going to get a very good solution. But I think that they're very good at caging people, and I think that's why mass incarceration has been a huge success for the ruling class in this country. The United States is really number one in a lot of things, and I think the biggest thing that we can say that we're number one in is how many people we lock up. And the United States has roughly 5% of the world's population, but we've got 25% of the world's prisoners. China has 4 times as many people as the United States does and half as many prisoners. The United States has more prisoners than the Soviet Union did at the height of the purges and the collectivization in the 1930s and the infamous Soviet Gulag.
Poverty is a vicious cycle, rarely escaped by the poor. Studies found that scarcity can reduce mental capacity and cognitive performance. In children, it affects their brain development and memory. Additionally, the poor are often forced to live in areas of low air quality.
Far from being a problem for only the poor, all areas of the socioeconomic spectrum suffer when our air, food, and water are polluted by fossil fuel emissions and radiation from nuclear accidents.
The current energy infrastructure results in about 2.5 to 4 million deaths per year worldwide from respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, and complications from asthma.
We're in downtown Beijing and the pollution readings have once again gone off the charts. Readings are around 25 times World Health Organization standards.
Including 50 to 100,000 deaths per year in the United States and 16,000 alone in California.
The economic system that we're living in today is destroying the planet because it is based on an unsustainable model. We're seeing proof of that right now.
The current energy infrastructure, which has been going on for a long time, has resulted in the accumulation of greenhouse gases and particles that cause warming of the Earth's climate. And the Earth's climate is warming at a rate faster than any time since deglaciation from the last ice age. In addition, higher CO2 levels, CO2 is an acid, it dissolves in water, becomes carbonic acid, and has resulted in the acidifications of the oceans, and this is destroying coral reefs.
We have to realize our planet does have a certain amount of regenerative power, and there's no question that we've been through numerous worldwide extinctions. We have fossil records of that, and the Earth has recovered. There is a limiting carrying capacity, though.
There are many additional impacts of global warming. Sea level rise is a very big concern. For example, right now there is about 65 to 70 meters of sea level stored in ice, mostly in the Antarctic, but also in glaciers in Greenland and also sea ice in the Arctic and other places. The temperature's warm enough that we melt all this ice. That means the sea levels will rise 65 to 70 meters, and that will cover 7% of all the world's land and result in all this is along the coast where most people in the world live. This will cause a significant disaster. We're also seeing enhanced storminess, increased intensity of hurricanes, and greater extremes of weather associated with global warming. So there are significant problems associated with this, and these are all tied back to the emissions from coal, oil, and gas combustion that have been occurring since the Industrial Revolution that started in the mid to late 1700s.
It is probable that war itself could be our undoing, let alone the environment. Our brutal, competitive behaviors are not human nature, but simply a result of scarcity, making us all competitors in the fight to attain what we need to survive. And while scarcity is naturally occurring, it's also intentional in industries and governments for profit and national interest. As long as nations are immersed in scarcity, we will continue to have conflicts between people. Crimes, murder, and other violence, to all-out war, the ultimate expression of human stupidity.
The ground shook in the U.S. bombardment.
Bomb the heck out of them.
These behaviors must be surpassed if we wish to survive.
That's the best recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda. This guarantees the cycle of violence will go on.
No! Peace in our time.
Nobody, including and most of all the United States, goes to war to liberate or spread democracy. The only incentive on a practical level to go to war is to acquire resources. In the United States case, it frequently is either energy resources, shall I say, supporting political alliances to preserve access to energy resources.
Smedley Butler, a U.S. Marine Corps General Major who was the most decorated Marine at the time of his death, stated it well when he wrote,
I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies. In China, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best that he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. War is a racket. It always has been. A few profit and the many pay. But there is a way to stop it. You can end it by disarmament conferences. It can be smashed effectively only by taking the profit out of war.
Our universities today are better equipped than ever. Best microscopes, the best scientific equipment, and the bombs are getting worse. The wars are getting worse. Killing is getting worse. You don't need to kill people, bomb cities. There's something wrong with our culture, very wrong.
To blame any individual or corporation does not get at the root causes of the problems. The structure of our socio-economic system itself has everyone out to meet their own needs, creating a predatory, competitive environment. Attempting to find solutions to the monumental problems within our present society will only serve as temporary patchwork, prolonging what is quickly becoming an obsolete system. Our social designs, language, and values have evolved from ages ago. The reality of scarcity in earlier times shaped our behaviors and remains deeply entrenched in all cultures today. The history of civilization is a story of change, and this includes our social systems as well.
There's no question that many jobs simply aren't coming back, but probably the biggest single driver of that is the way technology is racing ahead. If we continue on current paths, the next 10 years will be even more disruptive than the last 10 years because the technology is accelerating faster.
If you keep laying off people and putting in machines, which is happening in the auto industry, they pick up the whole car and turn around, shove the engine in, and moving people out. There comes a time when millions won't have the purchasing power to buy cars. That's when the system collapses.
But all of our growth is associated with increased consumption, increased use of energy and other resources. And when you ask economists, well, what's the alternative that enables us to continue to be prosperous without destroying the natural environment on which we depend? And they don't seem to have an answer for that.
There's no solution within the present day type society. People need information to be able to move into the future intelligently. Without information, there's no way you can develop a sustainable culture. It can't be done politically because the problems are technical. If you succeeded in arranging for the most ethical people in the world of the highest morality and put them in government, when your lights fail in your house, you need an electrician. When the dams don't generate enough electricity, you don't need a highly moral politician. you need an electrical engineer. So our problems in the world can be solved by technical people. Now, language itself is subject to interpretation. When you say something, it goes through my filters and comes out a little different than what you mean. Now, if you had that in the scientific world, engineering world, when engineers talk to each other, they use physical reference for their language. If they all interpreted what they think the other guy meant, you couldn't build bridges, they'd collapse. So in medicine, when a doctor says hemostat, the nurse doesn't hand him a towel, she hands him a hemostat. So that language is very precise.
The thing about science is it's independent of culture, religion, language, everything. That's why scientists from around the world can work together. We all speak the same language.
They're talking specifically. A wonderful thing about a blueprint, if you give a blueprint of an automobile to Italy, China, France, they all turn out the same automobile because it has uniform interpretation.
I was just giving a lecture about two very important results which vastly disagree. What did the two groups do that vastly disagreed? They decided to work together. And their interest was determining what nature tells us, not what they wanted to be true.
There's no Chinese way of building airplanes. There's a mathematical way.
Oddly enough, we've never applied the methods of science and engineering on a global scale to achieve a more just and equitable social arrangement. Our failure to do so leaves us continuously on the brink of oblivion.
Scientists were never asked to design a society without automobile accidents. They were never asked to design a city that's self-sufficient. You know, when you took the Manhattan Project, they were supported, so they built the atom bomb. We're working on the wrong things. The society I'm talking about is global cooperation, where all the nations work toward improving the lot of humankind. Now, why do that? Because the smarter people are, the richer and more secure everybody is. But in the future, when you join all the nations together, and they can see the advantage of sharing all the Earth's resources and all the knowledge by all nations, once they realize that advantage, they will join together. If they do not, they'll kill each other.
That's what endless warfare has led to. Brigandage. What else could happen? But we, who are all that are left of the old engineers and mechanics, have pledged ourselves to salvage the world. We're the last trustees of civilization when everything else has failed.
If our planet had a common catastrophic threat, such as a large meteor heading toward the Earth, nations would unite and call upon science and technology to solve the pending catastrophe. Border disputes would cease. Bankers, lawyers, and businessmen would be unable to solve the problem. Resources would be harnessed without cost or profit. Today we face many common threats, far beyond national boundaries.
In the world today, we have enough resources to solve most human problems. We can build cities, hospitals all over the world if we use resources. But if you conscripted all the money in the world, there's not enough money to build hospitals and housing all over the world and finance the education of students. But we do have enough teachers and enough buildings we can use for universities. We have the resources. Money is an interference because it limits our ability and it limits our dreams.
Imagine the possibilities of an unprecedented mobilization of scientific and technical alliances toward problem solving without the interference of money or politics to initiate global unification and restoration.
If our planet ran out of resources, no matter how much gold or money or possessions you had, you could not survive. Our entire survival is based upon resources.
growing up in the Great Depression in the early 1930s in New York City was a catalyst for his life's work. Jacques explored many different social alternatives during that time, but all seemed insufficient. He rejected the obsolete teaching methods of the time and was granted special privileges by his principal. He read books that furthered his interest in human behavior and social change. His early research with training and observing animals led him to similar findings with people as well. He concluded the environment shapes our values, our identity, and generates our behavior. Fresco witnessed great suffering and scarcity, even though Earth was abundant with resources. He saw it was the rules of the game we play by that were at fault.
What is really needed is the intelligent management of the Earth's resources. A resource-based economy is based on the carrying capacity of the Earth and its resources. If you don't work in terms of existing resources, you're working in some metaphysical plane. In a resource-based economy, all resources would become the common heritage of all the world's people, and access to the necessities of life would be for all the world's people. There would be no more monetary systems or trade, barter, or any other system of human servitude.
A resource-based economy allows social advancement and worldwide reconstruction in the shortest time possible.
A resource-based economy operates as a balanced load economy. This means avoiding shortages and overruns, thus optimizing efficiency and conserving energy. There would be no excesses and little waste. It would be balanced to the environmental conditions and human needs. For instance, there would be no houses without people in them, or cargo trains traveling empty or stored in freight yards dependent on the business cycle for their use. This also ensures natural resources are not depleted as in our present system.
Here's where I got the ideas from: the human body. The brain says, if I do all the thinking, I want most of the nutrients. Then the lungs would say, just a minute, if I don't oxygenate the blood, you couldn't work as a brain. So the brain says, all right, I'll give you whatever you need. Then the liver says, if I don't filter, the brain and the lungs will die. So every organ gets whatever the hell it needs. And so you have a system that works. When you get an infection in your toe, there's no committee meeting, no democracy, where they send the committee to the brain, say there's an infection in the toe. The brain says, we're going to do a 3-month study. By that, your infection's up to your knee.
So our goal is to replace all fossil fuels. There's 30 times more solar available worldwide over land in high solar locations than we need to power the entire world for all purposes in 2030. And there's 7 times more wind than you need to do the same thing. So we are looking to combine all clean renewable energy sources that are available: wind, solar power, geothermal power, hydroelectric tidal power, and wave power. We would need about 4 million large wind turbines to power 50% of the entire world for all purposes. You might say, well, that sounds like a lot. But keep in mind, during World War II, the world produced about 800,000 aircraft in the space of 5 to 6 years, and the US produced 330,000 aircraft in 4 to 5 years. And so that was decades ago, and now we have better technologies and abilities to ramp up production. So it really comes down to willpower. It's not a technological or economic blockade to solving this problem. It's really a social and political blockade.
We still have neural lag. It's hard for us to step into the future without dragging some of the past. We won't make the history books of the future. We are that ignorant. Not in technology. We're doing fine in computers, electronics, but the human value system is not moving fast enough, I would say that people would be much more productive, much more humane, much happier people. That is the question. Will people be happier with new technology? No, not new technology alone, but with a value system and new technology. In many instances, we ask people for their opinion. Do you think man will ever get to the moon? They may say, maybe 10,000 years from now. Instead of saying, I don't know enough about that to give you a sensible answer. That's the way you talk. But they have opinions about everything. There'll always be war, there always has been war, because man is greedy. That's what a repeat or a loop of what they've heard in the past.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
People are reinforced in this culture to be greedy. The more you have, the more you abuse other people. In order to get what you have, you're looked upon as being successful. You admire the people with money that have those things. And they usually get it off other people's backs that they abuse terribly. So you're not born being greedy.
People think that you can't change human nature. If you couldn't change it, we'd still be living in caves. So obviously we're undergoing change. So human nature is not fixed. And greed is brought about by scarcity or lack of resources.
Well, there are some animals that are very docile. The cows on the next field, they wouldn't hurt each other at all. But when we approach them with oranges, because there's a scarcity of oranges, they start bucking each other. So it's really a matter of scarcity.
Some people believe that there's such a thing as human intelligence. Remember that an intelligent electrical engineer of 75 years ago could not get a job today. So what you once called intelligent was intelligent at that time within that frame of reference. It's an ongoing process. Now, what is the real meaning of intelligence? The ability to extract significant information from any situation. I would say it depends on the next 20 years. We'll know whether there's intelligent life on Earth. Depends on what we do about the environment and what we do about the human problem. Poverty, hunger in the world, sickness, and waste of resources. If we learn how to manage the Earth's resources intelligently, we can overcome most of the problems in relatively short time. Creativity is taking known systems and putting together in unique ways and adding few things to improve the product. That goes for music, art, drawings, invention. But if you study the history of invention, you will see a relationship and tie of all these variables. I think that's part of the propaganda of each system that tells people that the financial gain is the main motivation in people. It is the people interested in money, but there are other people that are motivated by other interests, medical research. People devote their lives to it. There are people that work real hard and save up money and go to Africa and spend all their time trying to help people. They're not motivated by money. And I am suspicious of people that are only motivated by money.
And a $40,000 gold fucking watch.
It's not a healthy motivation. If you want to know what kills incentive, is you give people the minimum amount of money, minimum vacation, hard, dirty work with no future. A man that washes dishes in a restaurant, they keep bringing a new pile in every 20 minutes, and he sees no out. He can never buy a home or own a car. He doesn't own enough. So what incentive is that? But he has to wash the dishes because he got 2 kids, he's got to feed them, and that's not good for mental health at all. What will motivate people? A world without war, poverty, hunger, loss of employment, loss of income. Your incentives and options are tremendous. Thousands of different things to do now that you got your food and housing and education. Now you go to work on solving not all problems, but all the problems of that time. So we do it because we are functionally selfish, meaning being selfish for yourself alone is detrimental, but functionally selfish means take care of the environment, share ideas with people, and in that way we all gain. They can see on the news every day that everything they do goes out there to all humanity. So everybody in the world represents an extension to their life rather than everybody selling themselves and making a profit on one another. They now have the time to appreciate what the new world does, and all the films of the future will show them what's happening all over the world and what's new, and that they have free access to what's new because everybody cares about everybody else. If the environment is structured, it produces what you would call ethical and moral behavior. But if you don't alter the environment, it'll keep producing what you got now. So the environment has to be changed. That means the schools, the things we learn, our language, all of these things have to be updated. I think that people will be ethical to the nature of the world. Ethical not because it says so in a book. They're ethical because it's better for them and better for society. So the new ethics is based upon the carrying capacity of the earth rather than my opinion. Will it be a democracy? It never was a democracy. It's been corrupt all the way back, only it's never been disclosed. Did you vote for the space program? Did you vote for the building of warships? Did you vote for any wars? What the hell do you mean by participatory democracy? It never existed. These are words. Whenever you hear democracy and freedom, watch out. That means it doesn't exist. In a world where it does exist, there are no proclamations as to human rights. It's built into the system. Black studies, women's studies are all part of a system that hasn't achieved that. In the future, for example, if you said, you know, there ought to be more kindness in the world and more cooperation, they would say, how do you do that? If you have nothing to offer, they say, why do you make noises? They would not accept that as anything sensible. Emotions are superfluous to the task. Now, another thing that really confuses people is the word love. Well, what would happen if you live with a replica of yourself? How long do you think you'd be together? How soon would you crash? So do you love yourself all the time? Of course not. How can you love another person? You only love certain things about people and certain things about yourself. The word love will disappear in the future and be replaced by a newer definition called extensionality, meaning enhance one another's lives. But I love you are just empty words that manifest nothing. It's how people behave to one another that indicates love. There's another thing that's very dangerous, claiming to be aware or conscious. You hear that all the time, at least I'm conscious. Well, I usually meet with those people and I say, where is your liver? I'm not sure. How fast is the blood moving through your veins and arteries? What area of the brain controls creativity? What area is responsible for emotions? What do you mean by consciousness? The human being on top of the Empire State Building can see a 3-foot ball, but a chicken hawk can see a dime and see whether it's heads or tails. The term used, consciousness or awareness, is limited to your senses. So we can never be conscious. We can grow in degrees and understand perhaps a little more about many more things, but we never can achieve consciousness because we don't see gamma rays, cosmic rays. We don't see all of those things without instrumentation. Religion has an old book with a lot of myths, packed with myths, and it doesn't change every year. Consider this. A scientist has a book on astronomy. Every year that book undergoes change. If you have a book on electronics that's 2 years old, it's obsolete. So they undergo change. But here's a minister with that one book under his arm. A real simplistic interpretation of the earth. And it caters to what people fear. What happens after death. We don't want people to have loyalty to corporations or a country. We want them to have loyalty to methodology and loyalty to invention, meaning to improve everything that exists, to make them better, smarter, faster, and make them available to all people. That's the kind of loyalty that's needed. If China comes up with a new way of producing automation, congratulations. If Africans come up with a great idea, congratulations. No more loyalty to corporations, to country. Loyalty to the earth and to all the people on it, and to make the earth a far better place than it is. This is the kind of loyalty I'm talking about. This is the kind of pledge allegiance I'm talking about, to pledge allegiance to methodology.